Well, hi everybody and welcome back. My name is David Swain from the National Disability Coordination Officer Program, and I'll be facilitating the session today. Before we officially start, I'll cover off on some housekeeping. So our conversation today is being captioned by Bradley Reporting. Jane will place a link to the OneCap page into the chat for you, or you can run the captions in a browser, or you can activate the captions using the CC button. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the Coordit website, usually within a day or so of the event in the Accessible IT Procurement Guide section. You're not muted by default, so you can unmute, but if you're not talking at any time, please ensure that you are muted to avoid any background noise coming through. You can use the chat function if you have any questions or if you want to ask something or highlight anything. You can also use the raise hand function and I'll facilitate you in. Or if you need to, you can just unmute and speak, whatever works for you. So welcome all to the session. The NDCO program, ADSET and Coordit would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. Where I am, in Townsville, I recognise the Bindal and the Wulgarugabar peoples and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. This is workshop 4 of 5 of our series focusing on accessible ICT procurement policies and procedures, during which we'll provide you with an understanding of how to interpret responses from vendors. We'll have a look at what they really mean when they say what they say, and how to interpret the accessibility conformance reports, or ACRs for short, along with follow-up questions that the procurement team may wish to ask of the vendors. Today's session is being run by Andrew Arch and Neil Jarvis from Intopia, which I think most of you will be familiar with by now from our previous sessions. ADSET and the NDCO program would like to thank and acknowledge Coordit for their commitment to the important work that this has been, and we hope that the guide and the supporting workshops are valuable for you and your teams. If this is your first session, the Accessible ICT Procurement Guide that these workshops are built around is available on the Coordit website alongside the previous session recordings, and we'll place the link for this into the chat for you. Okay, without any further ado, I think we should get into the session. So I'd like to hand over to Andrew and Neil. Take us away.
David, so today we wanted to run through some of the responses that you might get back from your vendors. Last week, we encouraged you to ask questions, very specific questions about accessibility in a number of ways and at different stages of the process, because if you leave it till the contract is about to be signed, it's a bit too late to ensure that the vendor you've chosen can actually meet your accessibility requirements. So let's explore what to do when a potential vendor actually answers those questions that we talked about last week. As in many areas of life, it isn't just what they say in their answers, it's just the words that count, but they say them, and sometimes what they don't say. Sometimes what they say instead of what you might expect as an answer. So let's, as we've done previously, let's just have a quick poll thrown up to see what your background is and what you know about what a response might look like. Thanks, Jane. So do you know what an ACR is? And does your institution ask for ACRs when they put out an RFT seeking responses for some ICT equipment? Jane, are we stabilising?
Yep, I'll end the poll now.
Okay, and I can see that we've had about 2/3 of the people say they don't know what an ACR is, so that's good. That's what we're going to run through today, spend a fair bit of today looking at, because that is what most international companies will be offering you. The large tech companies will be offering you an accessibility conformance report. And the people who have responded to the second question, does your institution ask for an ACR? We've had 33% of those you present say no, and 11% say yes. And if I just scroll that down, and about just under 60% say don't know. Okay, that's all good. We will put that into those results into the slides when in time for them to be published when they go up on the Cordit site.
So
Thanks for responding.
yes, thanks very much for responding, folks. It gives us an idea of where people are sitting in terms of knowledge and understanding of the documentation that they're likely to encounter. So it's good to recap on, before we go any further, as to why it matters in terms of the wording that is used when a vendor tells you how accessible they are or not. So it's perhaps useful for us to revisit some of the messages that we gave you last week when we were looking at why it's important to ask the right questions, because the reason why it's important to ask the right questions is pretty similar to the reason why it's important to understand the answers to those questions. And we said last week that we reminded people that your institution will spend potentially millions of dollars on ICT equipment and software systems over time. It needs to have as much confidence as possible that it is being able to pick up the most accessible equipment and software that's available. There are too many uncertainties when it comes to how accessible a potential vendor's product might be. And so knowing the questions to ask and how to understand the answers you get back is going to be really, really important. The vendor will often overstate the accessibility of their products, either because they don't really know any better, and that's understandable. A lot of vendors are not steeped in this knowledge and information, but that doesn't help you when you're trying to make a decision. But that might be one of the reasons why they might either intentionally or unintentionally overstate the level of accessibility, but you don't want to be burnt. They might do it because they're being a bit cheeky. They're taking a little bit of a shortcut in terms of what is actually accessible and what isn't. And we do even know that there are occasions, hopefully not very many, but there are occasions where vendors have been less than truthful about the level of accessibility of their product, either because, again, they don't really understand the question, or they haven't applied the right tests to ascertain the accessibility of their product. So whatever the reason, you need to know the answer and you need to understand what they're telling you. The other thing to watch out for is that the correct terminology is being used. It may be that a vendor is using terms that make it sound like something is more accessible than it is. And again, that's not attributing blame necessarily. It's just a less than rigid application of some other terminology that needs to be used. Terminology exists for a good reason, and that is that it sends clarity as to what is meant. But if a vendor doesn't give you quite the answers that you expect, or doesn't use the wording that you expect, but uses something similar, you're going to be in a bit of a quandary as to whether or not they actually are telling you their systems are accessible, or whether they're just nearly accessible, or actually they're not at all. So using terminology, really, really important.
So there's many ways in which that vendor may answer the questions you've asked. They may include individual responses to those questions. They may share a detailed accessibility report. It may be a combination of those. they may ask for at the presentation, walk through the questions that you've asked when you call a shortlist in to present their product. A detailed report always looks impressive. It's always if they bothered to have one prepared, but if they have, they must be serious about accessibility, right? Not necessarily. It depends partly on who prepared that report. And the devil really is in the detail of what goes into that report. You've got to think about, was it prepared by an expert in their house, by the market team, might have prepared that. So what we want today is sort of walk through what the larger vendors, the international vendors in particular, were prepared and should be available. Hopefully they're available on their website, but I know in circumstances where the report has had to be asked for, it's not in public space, always makes me a little bit wary. What are they trying to hide? Anyway, let's take a look at what an accessibility conformance report is, how it relates to what everybody talks about, which is the VPAT, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Certificate template, and then we'll go on to make some sense of the detail that could be provided in there. So we'll walk through the various components and how to interpret some of that, what to look for, what to raise questions about that might not look right, and so on. So let's look at what a VPAT is and what an ACR is in a bit of detail. I'll let Neil start off.
Yeah, and the other thing that we'll do towards the end is just draw attention to a couple of examples to show you real reports in the wild, as it were. So what are VPATs, as people call them, and ACRs? Let's define some terms first of all, because we all know jargon is horrible and abbreviations are chief jargon. VPATs. For a VPAT is as Andrew just said there, a voluntary product accessibility template, and an ACR is an accessibility conformance report. When a vendor offers you a VPAT, what they're actually providing for you is an ACR. The two terms are often used interchangeably. VPATs are what ACRs are based on. And in fact, the clue is in the name. The template, which the voluntary product accessibility template, is the template that is used to generate the accessibility conformance report. So when you ask a vendor for one of these, you really do want them to give you the accessibility conformance report. If they just give you the template, they're probably you'd end up with a blank template, and that's not what you want. The voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT, as I will keep calling it from now on, is a document that has been put together and maintained by the US Information Technology Industry Council, or ITIC. That's the body responsible, as I say, for creating and maintaining and revising the VPAT upon which an ACR will be based. They will come out with periodic revisions over time to enhance it, improve it, and make it relevant to the changing technologies that are around. The template is designed to assess the accessibility of software, hardware, software as a service products, and the latest versions of the template come in several versions, several flavors, if you like. There are 4 of them. And I'll quickly go through what those 4 are, just because you're liable to come across them in the course of procurement work, and you want to know which version has been supplied. And there are good reasons why a specific version will be chosen by a vendor. I think currently we're at version 2.4 revision, and each of the 4 are at that level. So a VPAT 2.4 for Section 508 is the revised standards for the based on the US Section 508 requirements. These are requirements laid down by the federal government in the US. It's an accessibility standard, and anyone who is attempting to provide services to federal government agencies needs to meet the standards required by Section 508. There's a second revision, a second version rather, and that second version is one that is based on the European Union's EN 301549 standard. That's a standard which has also been adopted in Australia since 2020. It provides for accessibility requirements of ICT products and services. It doesn't matter whether they're software or hardware or services. These are standards that we really want to see followed and maintained. And if the VPAT has been completed based on that, it's going to give you a good idea. So again, that is something which we're particularly interested in Australia. The third version is one that is based around the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's the guidelines that set down success criteria for websites and other digital products, as people will know. They are the standards for the guidelines for those influence the third of the four versions of the VPAT. And the fourth one is the sort of called the international version, and that is really a combination of the first three. So you'll get some vendors who will be deciding to provide a VPAT that covers all three of those standards, because they're working in multiple jurisdictions, in multiple countries, in multiple markets, and so they'll have to make sure that they meet all the various standards and requirements. Typically in Australia, we would be looking for the second or the third version that I mentioned, or flavor that I mentioned, the EN 301549 version and the WCAG version. They're the ones that really matter to us. If you get offered an international one for version 4, for the third, or for the fourth version, that's fine, but it will have Section 508 requirements in as well, which are less applicable to Australia.
The ITO, the Information Technology Industry Council, also provides a series of videos and slide decks as training for preparing an ACR. So if your vendor, if you ask them for an ACR and they say, what's that? You can point them to that page of the where the templates are, but more particularly, what it means to fill it in and what bits they need to pay attention to, and some instructions for them on how to do that. Hopefully, your bigger vendors won't need to be pointed to that, but it's also worth keeping in mind. And the link to that is in the toolkit for you to follow and share with vendors who might need a little bit of additional information, a little bit of coaching in what sort of information they might provide you with. So let's have a look at the structure of the VPAT, the template. The following sections, and I'm just going to run through them very quickly, should appear in the subsequent report that's generated by that template. First of all, the company name, obviously, so the title of the report should be Company Name Accessibility Conformance Report. Obviously, name of the product and the version, because we want to know how up to date it is. A description of the product to be sure that the name matches or what you think of the name is matches the the product that you think you might be looking to purchase. A report date, very important. Is it recent? Has it been prepared 4 or 5 years ago and they've released new versions at that point? It's these are just things that you can cross-check. They may have updated the version number, but left the report date old. It's a question then to ask, have you tested your latest version? The contact information, we talked about this last week. One of the questions is there a person you can contact? Mostly we find in a VPAT, in an ACR from the VPAT that, and I'm just starting to use the terms interchangeably because a lot of people in the accessibility industry just refer to them as VPATs. Internally in Entopia now, we're trying to refer to them as ACRs, but old habits die hard in terms of the terminology. What I'm saying is that that contact information, from my experience looking at the ACRs over many years now, is they tend to put a generic address, which is not a bad thing because people move around, different people change roles. So from that ACR perspective, that's probably reasonable just to have accessibility at acme.com. Whatever, but that. When you are asking them the question, who's the contact, you actually want to have a specific person, not a role, as we were saying last week. There'll be some notes about what they've covered, things that they have covered in that, because not everybody covers the entire product. What are the evaluations methods they've used? Have they used some automated tools? Have they done manual testing? Have they done usability testing with people with disabilities? And then the report information, was covered in that report. Sort of there's some overlap between some of these things as you look at different reports that have been generated. A definition of terms that they might have used, as Neil said, very important, so you can understand what they're going to be talking about when they use abbreviations or terms that you might be familiar with. And then there is a series of tables against which each guideline is reported against, and that's where the detail comes in. That's the nitty-gritty. But there's even in that earlier material, there's some stuff that we want to be sure that they're right. There's no red flags being jumping out at you out of that page, like the report date, like the version number, and things like that.
So you get the ACR, you get the accessibility conformance report from the vendor. Hopefully it's been an easy process to acquire it, and it's not, as Andrew was saying earlier, one of those cases where you've got to hunt high and low for it. It's hidden deep down on a website, or indeed not there at all. But hopefully it is there, or hopefully if it's not, the vendor has been able to supply one to you, assuming of course that they've created one. So there are some, reflecting what Andrew has just said with respect to the VPAT, on the ACR itself, there are some key bits of information you want to be looking out for. The first one is the date. That sounds obvious, but it really is important. Is the report a recent report, or has there been an update of the product that's been released since the date of the ACR? If there has been a release that post dates the ACR, then the ACR itself is only partly of use to you, because there could be many things that have changed in that release. They may be improvements, but they may not be. There may be regressions. So really important to know just how up to date this report is, and especially with respect to the release cycle of the product. Then evaluation methods that have been used. Which ones were they? What tools and what assistive technologies have been used to make the claims in the report? Was there any usability testing that was conducted with users with disabilities, for example? Or was the testing done predominantly by automatic testing methods, or there some manual testing that was done? Was there an audit done? And if so, what did that reveal? What were the applicable standards and guidelines that the tests were made against? That's obviously going to be important because it answers that question earlier that we raised about which standard is used. Is it the standard that you require? So they may have provided you with lots of really useful information about how the testing has proved that they conform to a certain standard, but if it's not the standard that you're looking for, again, it's only of certain value. Now, it is true that many of the standards do overlap, but not completely. So you want to be just really clear about that as well.
So in Australia, we're probably looking for conformance with WCAG 2.1, which is reflected in the Australian standard ASEAN 301549. But if they just give you a section 508, that is going back in time, and the US government in their section 508 revision only adopted WCAG 2.0. So you'll be missing out on those new criteria that have been built into version 2.1. So the conformance levels that they report on are also critically important to you. And there are 5 different conformance levels that they can state against each criteria that they might be reporting against. So the first of those is supports. Sounds fairly obvious. The functionality of product has at least one method that meets the criteria without known defects or meets with equivalent facilitation. So for instance, all images are provided with appropriate text descriptions, or all functionality is keyboard accessible. They're the things, it fully supports is what they're making a claim about. The next level is partially supports, where some functionality of the product might not meet the criterion. And then as we'll see, they're expected to provide some explanation. But what this actually means is most images, text descriptions, but there might be some text descriptions that are missing. We see this quite a lot looking through the ACRs that organisations are providing, because they're aware that done a really good job, but for some reason they've missed some and they want to get the product out the door. So they're publishing an ACR that admits partial support in some areas. Sometimes it might be because of the dynamic generation of an image or something like that. Likewise, most of the product's functionality is keyboard accessible, but one or two of the widgets or particular bits of functionality cannot be operated without using a mouse. Does not support. The majority of the product functionality does not meet the criteria. So most images might be missing alt text, or most functionality requires mouse operation. And for something that is, for instance, a drawing program, it might be that they haven't been able to provide the keyboard functionality, so they might quite clearly claim that most functionality requires a mouse and hence does not support. Not applicable. The criterion is not relevant to the product. For example, all the success criteria related to video content is not relevant if the product doesn't include any video content, or if it's a non-interactive document, then the success criteria related to keyboard access might not be relevant. And finally, not evaluated, and just keep an eye open for these. They again can be red flags. Why haven't they evaluated the product against a particular criteria? Technically, they're only supposed to apply this to level AAA criteria from Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, but we do occasionally see where they haven't evaluated the AA or AA criteria from WCAG 2.1. Again, as I'm saying, if you see not evaluated, then it's a red flag from an accessibility perspective. What's gone wrong? Why haven't they evaluated? Why haven't they been prepared to report on that?
So the main part of the report is a table and the tabular information which is there is of really, really critical importance. It's the main meat of the report, and it's reporting against each of the criteria that it needs to. So, what are those three columns? Those three critical columns in the table. Well, they are the criteria itself. In other words, what is being reported against. The level of conformance, that's the second column, and the third column is remarks and explanations, and we'll come to that shortly. If the ACR is reporting against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, then there should be multiple tables for each of the WCAG levels, level A, AA, and AAA. So bear that in mind. If you're only seeing one, that's something to consider. The remarks and explanations column is one which you might regard as one of the most important parts of this report, and it's in many respects it is the most important, because that's where all the nitty-gritty is really. It is where a description of why a product might not meet the supported level, where that description will be, and all the things that Andrew was talking about earlier in terms of what their explanation is for whether something is partly or not supported, or whether or not it was not even assessed because it was deemed to be not applicable. You would expect each of those assessments to be judged and to be experienced, to be explained as to why that was reached. So what are the watch points when you're reading an ACR? What are the things that you should be really thinking of and be aware of? Firstly, has the full VPAT been completed to generate the ACR? Did the vendor follow all the instructions of the VPAT? I mean, it sounds obvious, but it really isn't. If they haven't, then the VPAT is either new to them, the whole concept of a VPAT or the use of a VPAT is new to them, or it's not something that they're taking seriously. It could be either of those things, could be none of those things, but you need to know why it has not been completed in full. If that's the case, there could be a very good reason, but you would need to know that. And if the remarks column didn't tell you that, then you'd be asking those questions yourself. It's preferable really that a vendor has had the ACR created from a VPAT, but by an independent third-party expert, someone who is an expert in digital accessibility. And the reason for that is because you obviously are going to trust an independent assessment far more than one that's made by someone who's got a vested interest in it looking good. No one really is permitted to mark their own homework, although obviously it does happen quite a lot. And if they've got an in-house team, then it is quite likely that in-house team will have done the ACR themselves. But again, ask that question. Who created the ACR for you? Who was it? Is it your own work, or is it actually something which third-party independent people have made an assessment on? Is the product description accurate? An inaccurate or an unclear description of the product that can happen, and that would probably indicate that the ACR author didn't really know the product well enough, and hence the accessibility assessment itself could be called into question and could be suspect. So just be careful that you've got the correct description of what the product can and cannot do. Check the evaluation methods that have been used to make the assessment. Was it a mix of automated and manual evaluation methods? We mentioned before that both of those have their role, and they're both valuable, but you definitely need a mix of them if you're going to get a complete assessment. And it's always good, as we said before, to have usability testing done with real-world potential users. They're the ones that are going to identify any of the issues that might come up, even if something is technically compliant and technically meets the requirements of the standards and the guidelines. A real user might well draw attention to where something becomes harder to use, even though it is actually technically accessible. And if it is harder to use for them, you might want to know about that, because it's real people that use these products, not machines. Ideally, every criteria will be in the supported bracket, but of course, the reality is that that's not very likely to happen. Very few products would be fully supported by in every WCAG or other criteria. You just wouldn't reasonably expect that, and that's okay. That's what matters is are they being upfront with you about that, and if they are, that's good. If they're saying that everything is supported, that to me is a bit of a red flag. If it's true, fantastic, all credit to them, but I really want evidence of that.
Absolutely.
Really, really important. And it pays. It really does pay to pay attention to those levels of assessment and how they're done. Other things to look out for are use of terms such as pass or fail, rather than the correct terms that we've already identified should be used. That kind of suggests a lack of attention to detail, and it may not be important, but it might be. So just again, use your judgment when seeing those terms used. As we say, lots of people would love to be able to say everything is supported, but we know it often isn't. What about on the other side of the coin, significant numbers of not supported or items? If they're not supported and they're there in large numbers, you'd want to know why, and are there plans to change that? Is there a roadmap for remedying that situation? What is the reason for only having partial support? And if there are lots of items that have the label of being partially supported or not supported, then in that case, are there any explanations given as to why that might be? Again, in the remarks column, is that something which is given full attention? And what alternative methods are they recommending that are used as workarounds in the meantime? And then what is it? We mentioned the roadmap. Well, a roadmap is fine, but you also need that roadmap to be time-based. What are the timelines for putting right issues that are not supported at all, or that are only partly supported? How long is it going to take? And therefore, is it viable for you to take a gamble on that when you're making a purchasing decision? And lastly, items that are flagged as not evaluated or NA, not applicable. There may be very good reasons why they're not applicable or why they haven't been evaluated, but if you reasonably believe that they should have been, why weren't they? You're going to want to know the answer to that. So again, make sure that question has been answered in the remarks column. If it hasn't been, you're going to want to go back to the vendor and ask further why that wasn't the case. In other words, don't allow them to use not evaluated or not applicable as a get out clause for it not being supported at all.
Okay, so there's some of the things that you want to particularly be watching for in the report and in the reporting tables. Things that can raise little warning bells or great big red flags in terms of how accurate, how useful, who prepared this report, how much can you rely on the report that you're being offered. So let's have a look at a couple of examples, and we've chosen examples that you're probably all familiar with, some bits of software. First is Microsoft Office 365, and there's a screen grab showing the MS Office accessibility report available to download for Mac and Windows. Interestingly, the Mac version is dated August 2023. They've obviously just updated that and released it at the start earlier this month. However, the Windows version for MS Office is dated January 2022. Question, is this out of date? Has new functionality been added since January 2022? Now, that's over 18 months ago now. I don't know the answer to that because I haven't dug into, been tracking what's new in Word. It might be that all the releases that I see coming through are just security updates, because Microsoft released an awful lot of security updates these days for Windows and for their Office products. But it might be that there's some new functionality that hasn't actually been tested against the accessibility requirements under whatever standard Microsoft are reporting against. So we can't be sure. It's a little bit of a red flag. As I've updated the ACR for Mac, but not for Windows. And I know they're independent products and independent product teams that are producing those, but still, it just it was a slight warning for me when I saw those very different dates there. Adobe Acrobat Pro is the other one that we looked at, and now again the date. Neil, do you want to talk through that one?
So they've used an older version of a VPAT first of all to assess this. So even the VPAT's not up to date, so let's just look at what they did do. The products and the versions included Adobe Pro, Classic, Standard, plus Adobe Reader. Now, look, I'll be very upfront with you. There are so many versions of Adobe and Acrobat products, I've lost track. So all I would say is that keeping track of all those in itself is quite a task. Something that you would want to be across with if a similar product was in that situation. So
it did strike us a little bit odd that they're rolling the Reader in with the Acrobat Pro, which is a reader, but it's also an authoring tool. So that struck us as a bit odd when we were looking at this one.
It really did. They filled out the description. It says that Acrobat Pro, for example, is designed for creating, editing, and collaborating, and distributing PDF documents. Okay, that's fairly, and forms. That's fairly straightforward. It's fairly correct. The date, January the 5th, 2020. So you would reasonably, if you were looking at a product that was providing you an ACR of January the 5th, 2020, and you're doing that in late 2023, and you know that it's a product that has several releases between then and now, and in the case of this product, we know that was the case. Is that too long? Is that too far back for it to be a helpful evaluation for you. It may not be, but it probably is in an instance like this. So again, use your judgment. Ask that question. Make sure that you're deciding whether or not this is going to be helpful to you or not. And it then goes on to describe the user journeys and the methods used for testing. In other words, the things that you would be achieving with this document, which bits were tested. That's important because products like this can do many things, and you may find that only bits of it have been tested for accessibility. So here they have helpfully listed the kinds of things that they have tested. I won't read them all out, but things like, yes, creating a PDF, exporting a PDF, preparing a form, looking at the accessibility of said form and said PDFs, creating action lists, editing a PDF, enhanced scanning, things like that, most of which I haven't got a clue what it means because I don't use PDF often enough. But were I in a situation where I was making a decision as to whether to acquire 10,000 licenses for a product of this sort, I would definitely be ensuring that my subject matter experts were across this. And then it talks about the evaluation methods that have been used for arriving at the ACR, and it goes into an explanation of the use of screen readers and screen magnifiers. That it also talked about native platform accessibility features, so those were used as part of the testing as well. And it says that all of these were supplemented with techniques such as manual inspection of accessibility applications. So it then goes on to talk about the kinds of conformance guidelines that were used, which is really helpful. And not surprisingly, you see things in there like Section 508, WCAG, EN 301549. Remember, this was Adobe, which is a multinational organization. It has products in countries all over the world. So not surprisingly, it has has attempted to create an ACR based on all of those standards.
So let's have a look at the table well, a representative table that is in the Adobe Acrobat Pro, Adobe Acrobat Reader's ACR. So the first table is for guideline, and there's they'll have tables for each guideline. So the first guideline under WCAG, guideline 1.1, text alternatives, provide text alternatives for any non-text content so that it can be changed into other forms people need, such as large print, braille, speech symbols, or simpler language. And then they have the table that is their assessment of that. And we've got the right format of that table. They followed the instructions fairly well. We've got a criteria column, a conformance level column, and a remarks and explanations column. And then the first row has 1.1.1 non-text content level A from WCAG. And they say it also applies to EN 301549 criteria. And they actually listed 7 clauses there that are within that EN 301549 from the European Standards Organization. And they also talked about 2017 Section 508, which is probably not the updated version. And they listed 3 clauses that have been addressed that get picked up under this WCAG 1.1.1 non-text content. Then in the conformance level, they're saying supports, and they're saying that altered content supports. So they're making a claim that any of their images will have all of their images, not any of them, but absolutely every image that might be in that product will have an alt text and an appropriate alt text. And if you're using it to author or repair a product, you can make sure that you are adding alt text to all those images.
That's a brave
and then they've
claim.
got It is. But having used Adobe Acrobat Pro over many years, yes, that is built into the authoring tool part of the product. But I haven't checked the software itself whether their own images have. And then the third column, the remarks and explanations, they're saying that the software itself, and at that point they're talking about the software as a reader. The product provides text alternatives for non-text content. So they're making that blunt state, is black and white, that that's what they're claiming. And then for authored content, somebody who, if you're going to be authoring using the Acrobat Pro, but more commonly you might be preparing using Acrobat Pro, authors can ensure that content meets this criteria, throwing that back to you to do that. Okay, so it just gives you a flavour of two common products that you're probably all familiar with in one way or another, in terms of how honest or otherwise some of those things are. Are they little just little warning bells, or are there some big red flags, as we were commenting on with the Adobe Acrobat one, where they're using template 2.2, not the latest 2.4.
Probably worth saying as well that we've spent time going through the things that you need to watch out for, because that's what counts, that's what matters. How people say what they say is as important, as we said earlier at the beginning, as what they actually say, so what they claim. There may be very good reasons why they don't meet or appear to meet all the criteria. It's not that they're necessarily providing a bad product, but it's simply a question of you knowing or being able to satisfy yourself that when certain flags are raised, that there is either a good reason for that, and actually that's an acceptable reason, or it's actually something to be concerned about and something to go back to the vendor with. And in that situation, you would then apply some of the other rules that we talked about last week and earlier in the series, that if they're not meeting the accessibility requirements that you need them to or you want them to, that they have something in place that will get them from the current non-compliant state to a better state in the future. Because if you're going to be investing millions or hundreds of thousands into a product, you don't want to be taking gambles.
So your time to question us, and let's see if we can give you some good answers that are what you're expecting and that are understandable. We'll try and use plain language.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Andrew and Neil. And it was good to get into some of the nuts and bolts of working with vendors on this. And I'm assuming there will be questions, because you certainly delved into it. Darren, in deploying the memes in the chat.
Yes, sorry,
just saw that.
Just thank you so much. Could I just comment? Thank you. Yeah, it's. I think you'd mentioned both Neil and Andrew. It's the what's not said. So you really have to be really careful reading the bits of there. I posted something to Andrew many years ago. I saw one that just had this doesn't it only applies where applicable, kind of thing. So they basically made the decision about where they thought it was relevant or not. And you have one of the key features of your bit of software is this, and you're saying it's not applicable to it, which kind of really leads to your lack of understanding of what's being asked. But that can be given from that first correspondence. I've had a few of those where it comes back, yeah, it's accessible, it's available online.
Yes.
Okay, different terminologies. Yeah, exactly.
I might have given the example in the first session. I was working with an organisation just pre-COVID, and I wasn't involved in the procurement process. But I was working with the UX people, and I prompted them with a few questions because a vendor was coming in, and they hadn't asked the questions previously, but they had an opportunity now at the presentation stage, and they asked the vendor during at the end of the presentation, how accessible is your product? And apparently the response they got was along the lines of, yes, it's accessible. It'll work on your mobile device as well as on the laptop. And, as long as you've got signal, you can access it. A total misinterpretation of what accessibility meant from our perspective.
Yeah. And just a question while I've got you then. Do you often see, or have you often seen, I've only seen a couple of instances where they've provided like an alternative in there where they've said it doesn't meet in this criteria, but we wouldn't be expecting necessarily people to be using the date picker because we know that doesn't work, but we have got an alternate method for this to happen.
Yeah.
In terms of the tool can provide it in an accessible way if need be, but this component doesn't work because it's a third-party component that's part of their product.
Yeah. Yep, that's very much you do see that a lot, and you do see that the control they have over certain certain components of the product are limited by the fact that they are third-party components, but then they need to say that.
Yep. Okay.
That's the point. They need to, and as you say, if they've provided an alternative way to achieve the same thing that's not onerous and that's not doesn't require you to sort of do it telepathically or something, then it's that's how they have met that requirement. May not be perfect, but at least they're meeting in some way.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, and if things like a date picker, why not make it easy as well? Allow people to type it straight in. A lot of people using a mouse will just go and click on that little calendar icon. That's fine. If your date is, when did you purchase this product, and it was last month or maybe even last year. But if I've got to scroll back through one of those and I can't type in my date of birth, or the date I moved into a particular house, for whatever reason they might ask that, scrolling back through that date picker through many, many years becomes so tedious it almost becomes unusable, as well as being that date picker, potentially, and many of them are, inaccessible to somebody who can't use a mouse.
I had a very good example of that not so long ago, only a few months back, when I'd been visiting. I'm based in New Zealand, and I'd been visiting Australia, and I was coming back to New Zealand, and we are required, or we were at that time required, to fill in a traveller health declaration because of the COVID situation, and one of the questions was, as it nearly always is, your date of birth, which is always a horrible one to fill out. And it was a date picker. There was no edit field. It was simply a drop-down picker that was one of the lovely inaccessible varieties that are very prevalent on those sorts of forms. Or it was hard to use with a keyboard. Not impossible, but hard. I'm of a certain age, so I've got to go back a long way from the default, which bizarrely enough was 2022. So all the way back to 1964, which, there you go, that's my age, was tedious, and I was actually getting quite concerned I was going to get timed out. So those are real problems when it comes to components that might otherwise have been in the middle of a quite accessible experience. So an alternative is going to be really, and we'll be talking a bit about that next week as well.
Neil, Andrew, Steve said in the chat, BPATs and ECRs seem to be best applicable to externally provided commercial off-the-shelf products. I'm assuming that's the acronym there. What about for externally developed bespoke products, and even for internally developed bespoke products? Can the same format templates be used? I know we talked about this during the development of the guide a little bit about what happens when, say, for example, a university has a dev team and they build something. How do you evaluate that?
Yep, absolutely. You can use the same template. It's effectively a good way of providing a report against WCAG. If that's the standard, and that's probably the common standard that we'd be using for software products. So whether that software product is being developed internally or externally, having that filling in those two extra columns against each of the WCAG criteria. And saying, does it fully meet, supported, and etc., or not applicable, is quite an appropriate way of doing that. You probably will have audited the product, and at the end, hopefully you've audited the product that's been developed. You would hopefully, if it's been an externally developed product, you'd hopefully have required them to provide some sort of certificate of conformance. And if we do that for organisations, which we do on a regular basis, that certificate says what paths we've checked in the product, because sometimes you can't check absolutely every path. Like that, Adobe Acrobat Pro, it is so complex that it would be really surprising to me if they had somebody go through every possible pathway through that to, particularly AO using it as a editing product for repair. But if we're providing a statement for somebody, we could fill in, and we do, complete ACRs for some of the organisations we work with. But a lot of organisations, we just report against what the path was, and if they're wanting a statement that they can provide to somebody who is seeking the product from them, then we make it quite clear what's past, what's almost past, and where what might be critical in terms of what hasn't passed. But getting the external vendor who's doing that development for you, or even if they're taking a off-the-shelf product but customizing it and setting it up for your institution, get them to have a look at that template and say, can you report against this, and ensure that, because the developing company is probably not going to be, for a lot of these big international products, going to be the company that you're buying it from. You're going to be buying it from an intermediary who is going to come in and set it up. And the parent company that developed it in the first place, off the shelf, it might be fine, but by the time it gets incorporated into your system, you want to make sure that it's still fine, and it's quite reasonable to ask them to fill in that template and give you a report.
Something popped to mind too, Andrew, while you're talking. Is it an ISO? And maybe you or someone in the chat will be able to tell us about the development of accessible IT products and services. It's what I'm thinking of is how you would put a process in place. Say, for example, if an institution develops things, it's more of a process than a procurement issue, isn't it? So if you're developing software, you probably want to know, and Darren, you've alluded to it, have a good plan to let them know how it will be evaluated, but that should probably occur at the beginning of the development process.
The design process.
Yes, so you can pick up a bit of that.
Possible.
Bit of that from ISO IEC, if I've got the number right, 30071.1, which has also been adopted as an Australian standard about 18 months ago from memory. And that is about the processes you put in place to make sure that your organisation is developing and and producing accessible products at the end of the day, and talks about all those different spots where you should be testing throughout that process. So it's a good standard to go and have a look at.
Thank you very much. You've remembered it beautifully, Andrew. I've completely forgot where to find it, but I've Googled it, so there it is in the chat for people.
Okay. Yes. Not sure if that's the right one, but we'll make sure that we pick it up anyway.
If not, we'll certainly correct me.
And David, just to kind of go further on that point of especially for products that are designed internally, really important to always get the message out that the earlier you start on ensuring accessibility, the better. So if you've waited to the development stage, I mean, it's better there than till you get to the testing stage, but really you want to be doing it as early as possible. So go right back to design and start building accessibility at that point. It'll be cheaper in the long run.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, I suppose it's the last chance to ask any questions of Andrew or Neil before we conclude and see you next week.
Hi, it's Diane here from
Diane.
CG University. I may have maybe what could appear a stupid question. I know there's no stupid questions, as the ones that are not asked.
Not one.
However, I was wondering if, when you look for, software, how do you kind of find out which latest version should be applied? And because it's all good, you've got the report, you can read all that. And thank you very much for putting all this together. That was very interesting, by the way. Should have started with that. And it gives you, the version that they've been working on, etc. How do you know which version will be the latest? For example, if you probably have to do some research by yourself, but You've got any advice or any places that we can go looking and find the right thing to use or the right software? Is that a clear
In terms-
question?
Yeah, in terms of, if they're providing that ACR, in the toolkit, there's a link to the ITI website and where to find those templates. So you can quickly go and check, have they used the latest VPAT, the latest template to generate their report? And as we discovered that, that Adobe one was version 2.2, not what is available on the ITI website at the moment, which is version 2.4. So there's one place that you want to check, what version of the template have they used, but then in that report, they should have the version of the software or the release date of the software, and you can check that against what it is that they're offering you, because they a question might be, are you providing us with the latest version, assuming somebody who is bidding for a tender or putting a quote for you, will be telling you that we can provide, version 2.7.5, release 2758A. That's what they'll be talking to you about as the version that they're providing, and you can then go and match in that ACR against that version number. If they're providing just a statement of performance, as we do when we provide, do audits, and various organisations want a statement of conformance, we make it quite clear the date of that. So if the date of that report is old, then again, you're asking the question, what have you done since? What have you added to the product since that report was prepared? So you do need to do a little bit of that research yourself, but then you are enabled to ask the questions. Why is this dated 2020, and we're in getting towards the end of 2023 now?
So that would be picked up very much by that question of, okay, you gave this report in January. In the case of Adobe, January 2020. We know there have been releases since then. Are you offering us the latest release? Are you offering us an old version? And if it isn't, if it is the latest release, how valid is the report that you gave us for that latest version? And it is always interesting to see what the response to that question is.
And what would you consider being obsolete or late in terms of software? Because I understand, like, obviously 3 years, there must have been something done in that space because technology goes faster and improves.
On the product, I guess. It depends on the cadence of releases for the product. Something like the example that we were using, which was the Adobe, we know they've had a few releases since then for some of the products. So it really depends on the product itself. It may be one of those that just doesn't get updated very often. Not very likely nowadays, I grant you, but it could happen. So it may be perfectly legitimate that they haven't updated the ACR because there was nothing to update. But it's not that likely if it's more than three years old, I would say.
Yeah.
And you can ask them, what are the features that have been added or incrementally tweaked in that intervening period, and you can then make that call about, look, if they, that's probably fine. That mightn't be fine. What are they going to do about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dane. Darren, you had the hand raised, but I'm going to run ahead and assume that you put it in the chat, and I'm going to read it. Any tips on ensuring that accessibility features in a product are not disabled once integrated into various enterprise systems, as many options to disable accessibility can occur outside of the vendor?
True. And we have seen that with products. It comes to being installed, and in their infinite wisdom, the IT department who's responsible for actually loading that stuff into your institution's network has decided to turn something off. More often, though, we've seen that it's turned off by default, and somebody thought, why do we want to turn that on? Or they just didn't think about the fact that it could possibly be turned on. So how to check that we haven't actually made life more difficult. Don't have a good answer to that. Darren, do you have any comment on any experience with that yourself?
I think much like I just saw Neil do, just he put his head in his hands and sighed. It's very common. It seems to be, and I think that's part of the whole procurement process. So it's beyond just getting these, VPATs, etc. But it's, how much we value this, and does it follow through the entire life cycle of this procurement,
Yes.
not just what we got from the vendor, and then we check it once it's actually installed, not just because somebody said it was. I recall an incident of a learning management system going in, and then they went and put the single sign-in option over the front, and you couldn't sign in. That wasn't accessible.
Yes. Yeah.
Even though we'd made sure as much as possible that the LMS and things was fine, you couldn't actually sign in if you had a screen reader. So a barrier was there from day one that wasn't thought of because another party was working on that aspect of the project.
Yeah. And that's another argument for getting as much information from the vendor at the procurement stage, because then at least you can go back to your other people, to your own team, or the other third-party vendor even, and say, we know that this feature is actually in the product. Why have you broken it? Or what have you done? Or how can we get it back? But if you don't know it's even there because they haven't told you that it's even there, it's harder to do that.
Do you often, sorry, I'll just follow up with that. Have you found instances where, and I've only seen it I think once, and it was only in one topic, where the vendor was talking about how it interrelates with some other products that may break their product, where they've listed, there may be some issues with this, not a competitor's product, but there may be some issues doing this. It works well if it's in this environment, but as soon as you start playing with it outside of this, it may break.
I've definitely seen we can only be held responsible if it's used in this.
Their catch clause.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Fair and reasonable in some ways. So we are a little bit ahead of schedule. So if there is anybody else, I'll wait another 30 seconds or so. And if not, we'll conclude. Okay, well, the following session 5, is next week, and it's all about what if it's not accessible and what can you do. So plan B. And I see that Harley's put the link to the sessions and the recordings in the chat for you, so you can go and register for the 5th and final session, and all of the recordings will be available on the Quarter website. So thanks very much to everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Andrew and Neil, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.